When the tribune of the plebs, Terentilius, proposed to write down the Roman laws in 462 BCE, he was met with fierce opposition from the patricians, most prominent of whom was Caeso, a man of noble descent and great personal strength. Under his leadership, the tribunes were often driven away from the forum, and the plebeians were chased away and beaten. When the charges were brought forth against him, he fled the city. Not long after that, to the dismay of all plebs, his father was appointed dictator. Not much is said of Cincinnatus' early life. According to legend, he was born around 519 BCE, when Rome was still under the rule of Tarquinius Superbus. He was only a boy when the king was expelled and the monarchy abolished. Cincinnatus belongs to the first generation of Romans that don't remember the tyranny of the kings, and that will have to fight the temptation of power for the sake of the republic. Historical records first mention Cincinnatus as one of the men testifying in his son's defense. While chasing the plebs away from the forum, Caeso killed the brother of a former tribune. This was enough to bring him to trial. In the first recorded instance of bail, he was released from prison. Aware of the mountain of evidence against him, he fled to Etruria the same night. With his son failing to appear before the court, Cincinnatus was forced to sell most of his land to pay off the debt. He was left only with a small plot of land on the far side of the Tiber. From this impoverished state, his legend begins in earnest. During one of the usual Sabine invasions, Cincinnatus was elected consul. Today he is remembered as a defender of the people, but he was in fact a patrician who hated the tribunes and what they stood for. He blamed them and their laws for the recent misfortunes Rome had suffered. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the feeling was mutual. The tribunes saw him as just another patrician in a long line of oppressors. He blocked their proposals, and they in turn prevented him from levying any armies. They were locked in this stalemate for an entire year. Although a law was passed that no man could hold political office in consecutive years, the same tribunes were re-elected. To counter them, the patricians tried to appoint Cincinnatus as consul again. Enraged by this, he scolded them, "If you are so eager to break senatorial decrees, why should the plebs follow them?" Ashamed, the patricians elected new consuls, and Cincinnatus retired to his farm, but it wouldn't be long before he returned to public life. One day, while he was hard at work on his field, Cincinnatus spotted a party of men approaching in the distance. When they drew closer, he realized that the men were senators. After greeting him, they requested for him to don his toga. Surprised, he asked them if everything was all right. No, in fact, everything was not all right. The Sabines and the Aequi allied and once more waged war against Rome. One of the consuls was encircled near the city by the Aequi, and the other was far off fighting the Sabines, unable to assist. After putting on his robes, Cincinnatus was saluted as a dictator and quickly escorted to the city. After arriving to Rome, he didn't receive the warm welcome he might have hoped for. The plebs didn't forget him or his son, and they feared him, believing he was a greater threat to their freedom than the Aequian party knocking on the city gate. Every able-bodied man in the city was ordered to appear in the Campus Martius, fully armed before the sunset. When the army was ready, they set off at great speed. The consul had been encircled for 3 days now, and every second counted. They reached their target before midnight. After seeing Roman standards appearing in the distance, the consular army was reinvigorated. Attacks commenced from both sides and the Aequi surrendered before daybreak. Desiring no unnecessary bloodshed, Cincinnatus allowed the men to return home, but not before humiliating them by forcing them to pass under a yoke constructed of 3 spears. He returned to the city in triumph, mere 15 days after taking the office. The next day he forced Volscius, a man whose brother was allegedly killed by Caeso, to plead guilty to perjury and go into exile. After clearing the family name, Cincinnatus resigned and once more retired to his farm. With enemies defeated and external threats extinguished, the plebs continued their internal struggles. The Decemvirs came and went and the 12 tables were written, but this didn't satisfy the plebs, and their fight for equality continued. This is when our protagonist enters the story one last time. In the year 439 BCE, a great famine struck Rome once more. The Senate tried to purchase grain, but it was too expensive, and the people were destined to starve again. Spurius Melius, a very wealthy man of great ambition, saw his opportunity. He purchased the grain from Etruria at extortionate prices and handed it out for free. He won the hearts of the plebs and overnight became one of the most popular men in Rome. Wherever he went, the masses followed and praised him. Witnessing this, he believed himself to be above the law and began entertaining a dangerous idea. Why would he, so popular with the people, be a mere consul when he could be king? Putting his plan into motion, he began stashing weapons and bribing plebeian leaders. When the Senate caught wind of this, they went into a frenzy and appointed Cincinnatus, by now a man in his 80s, a dictator for the second time. He was the only man in the city who surpassed Maelius in both fame and popularity. Acting fast, Cincinnatus sent his master of horse to fetch Maelius. Refusing the summons from a dictator, Maelius was justly slain where he stood. The people were understandably angry at the death of a man who saved them from starvation. Cincinnatus explained that he was not killed for his alleged criminal activity, but simply for refusing to come before a dictator. He then ordered his house to be destroyed and left as a perpetual reminder to any man who fancied himself as king. His gold and grain were freely distributed to the plebs, which certainly helped to pacify them. With this, the political order was restored, and he relinquished the power bestowed upon him for the second and final time. Exact details of Cincinnatus's life were, like most of the stories of the early republic, lost to history. We can assume that his legend was altered by future historians, who aimed to show Cincinnatus as a bigger-than-life figure. Although he is praised throughout history for voluntarily giving up the mantle of a dictator and with it unlimited power, he was neither the first nor the last man to do so in Roman history. What made Cincinnatus special was giving up the power not for the hatred of monarchs, but for the love of the republic. Stories were imagined to show him as a perfect Roman, a man diligently working his field until Rome calls for him. He does the job that is required of him without hesitation and promptly returns to his farm. Romans of the early Imperium would often remark, "The greatest man of his time was found working his field and not eating figs from a sofa." When American General George Washington won the Revolutionary War, many of his compatriots expected him to crown himself king. Instead, he stepped down voluntarily and showed support for the emerging republic. For his love of the republic, he was often called American Cincinnatus, and a town was named in his honor. Join us next time as we discuss one of the early republic's greatest victories, which in turn set the stage for its greatest defeat.